Stop scrolling for 2 seconds, because this is one of those sports stories that looks normal on the surface until you realize what it actually represents. Caitlin Clark didn't just sign another brand deal. She didn't just do a harmless TV cameo. She stepped into a position that changes power in women's basketball, and the reaction around it is what's making people panic. Because here's the weird part. When a league finally gets the one thing it's been begging for, constant attention, mainstream conversations, year-round visibility, you would think the league would protect that momentum like it's priceless. You'd think everyone would be aligned. You'd think it would be celebration mode. But instead, the internet is exploding with one question. Why does it feel like the WNBA is treating the biggest spotlight they've ever had like it's a threat? And before anyone tries to downplay this as just fans being dramatic, let's be honest, this whole moment is sitting on top of a pile of pressure that's already been building. Money is changing in women's basketball. Media deals are changing. Player leverage is changing. Expectations are changing. And the CBA conversation hovering over everything makes it even more tense, because when a league is negotiating its future, nothing feels small anymore. Even a TV appearance can become a war. That's why this story hit so hard so fast. Because Caitlin Clark didn't just stay in the basketball conversation. She moved the conversation to a bigger stage. And in modern sports, the stage is the real power. The stage controls the narrative. The stage controls who gets framed as the hero, who gets framed as the villain, and who gets quietly ignored. So when Caitlin steps into that world, it doesn't just affect her. It affects the league. It affects players. It affects sponsors. It affects the next negotiations. It affects the next era. And then the warning chatter started spreading. Some people calling it real, others calling it exaggerated, others calling it spin. But either way, the reason it grabbed everyone is simple. It fits something fans already fear. A lot of people don't trust the WNBA to handle its own momentum. That's not me taking a shot. That's just the reality of how fans talk. People have watched for years as big opportunities show up, and then somehow get mishandled, slowed down, or buried under weird decision-making. So when they hear even a whisper of the league isn't happy about Caitlin taking a major media role, their brains immediately go, of course, here we go again. And then Stephen A. Smith enters the chat, and whether you love him or can't stand him, he has a gift. He can take what feels like a niche sports headline and turn it into a national argument within minutes. He doesn't just react. He frames it. And the moment he frames it, people pick sides. But the real story here isn't did someone get mad. The real story is what this move means in the long game. Because Caitlin Clark appearing on a major network isn't just content. It's positioning. It's leverage. It's influence. And in a league where influence is becoming more valuable than the jersey itself, that matters more than people realize. So let's start at the beginning, what Caitlin actually did, why it matters, and why this is the kind of thing that can quietly shift the whole balance of power before most fans even notice. Because once you understand the NBC piece, everything else suddenly makes sense, especially why certain people might want to control it. And that's where things get uncomfortable. At first glance, Caitlin Clark joining NBC looks simple. Cool, she's going to talk basketball on TV. End of story, right? Nope, not even close. Because in the modern sports world, the difference between a star and a superpower is not just what happens on the court. It's what happens when the season ends and the spotlight stays on you anyway. It's what happens when your name continues trending even when you're not playing. It's what happens when fans still feel like they're getting access to you year-round. That's what a network role does. It turns an athlete from a seasonal headline into a permanent presence. And for Caitlin, that matters more than it would for almost anyone else, because her entire rise has been built on attention at scale. She didn't become a phenomenon by being quietly great. She became a phenomenon because the audience followed her like it was appointment viewing. Her games didn't feel like random matchups, they felt like events. Her highlights didn't just get watched, they got argued about, debated, reposted, and turned into culture. So when you take someone like that and put her on a major platform, it's not just commentary. It's an expansion of reach. It's her voice being added to the machine that shapes what fans care about next. And the reason that's such a big deal is because sports don't run on talent alone. Sports run on storylines. Storylines create emotion. Emotion creates loyalty. Loyalty creates money. And the people who control the storylines control the direction of the league. That's why big networks don't just pay for games. They pay for the ability to build narratives around those games. So Caitlyn stepping into NBC's ecosystem isn't a cute side quest. It's her planting a flag in the media world, where narratives get decided. And that's where the chessboard changes. Because if Caitlyn is on NBC giving analysis, breaking down matchups, reacting to big moments, and staying visible when the WNBA isn't actively playing, then the conversation around women's basketball stops being limited to the WNBA calendar. It becomes a year-round product. That's what every league dreams of. The NBA doesn't vanish when the finals end. The NFL doesn't vanish when the Super Bowl ends. Their ecosystems stay alive because the media machine stays alive. Debate shows, previews, rankings, rumors, clips, podcasts. Those things keep the sport on the table, even when the games aren't happening. Women's basketball has been fighting to build that constant cycle for years. Not because the talent isn't there, because it is. The problem is the mainstream machine didn't always treat it like it deserved a permanent seat at the table. So when Caitlyn gets a role on NBC, that's the table. That's the seat. That's the microphone. And here's the part people are missing. Being the face of the league is one thing. Being a face on a major network is another thing entirely. Because now she isn't just dependent on the league to be seen. She has a platform that exists outside the league's direct control. She can keep her narrative alive even if the league tries to steer it somewhere else. She can add context to moments. She can frame the story. She can subtly shift perception just by what she emphasizes and what she doesn't. And if you've ever watched sports media, you know exactly how powerful that is. One sentence from the right person can change how a player is viewed for months. One quote can become a headline. One moment can become a clip that travels across every app. That's why this deal hit differently. It wasn't just Caitlyn gets a gig. It was Caitlyn expands her influence. Now imagine you're the WNBA. You're watching the biggest wave of attention you've had in ages. Ratings matter more than ever. Sponsors are watching. Partners are watching. Every decision gets magnified. The league is trying to grow and also trying to look stable and professional while it grows. In that environment, a star gaining independent media power can feel like a blessing or like a threat, depending on how leadership thinks. Because if leadership is confident, they see it as free promotion. More eyeballs, more relevance, more hype, more casual fans pulled in. But if leadership is insecure, if leadership thinks, hold up, what if she becomes bigger than us? Then the reaction changes. Suddenly it's not about promotion. It's about boundaries, about rules, about control, about who's allowed to do what. And even if you don't believe any of the warning talk, this is still the exact kind of moment that exposes how a league handles power. Does it celebrate a star building the brand? Or does it get nervous and start trying to manage the star? Because when fans hear conflict of interest, they don't hear legal language. They hear a power struggle. And the reason this NBC move is so crucial is because it's the kind of thing that changes negotiations behind the scenes. Think about it. The minute Caitlyn becomes a recurring media presence, her value isn't just measured in points, assists, or ticket sales. Her value becomes measured in ratings, impressions, audience demographics, and sponsor attraction. And those numbers become a weapon. If you can draw casual viewers to a broadcast, you have leverage. If you can bring non-traditional fans into the conversation, you have leverage. If your name helps a network sell ads, you have leverage. And leverage is the one thing leagues can't fake. They can write rules. They can issue statements. They can posture. But they can't fake leverage because leverage shows up in money and attention, and Caitlyn has both. That's why this isn't a small story. It's a stress test. It tests whether the WNBA is ready to operate like a league that understands modern celebrity athletes, or like a league that still wants the athlete to stay inside the box. And Caitlyn's entire career has basically been her refusing to stay in the box. She didn't become famous the quiet way. She became famous by being impossible to ignore, by pulling the spotlight toward her like gravity. And it didn't matter who liked it or who didn't, the audience chose. So now she's doing the same thing again, just in a different arena. Instead of the court, it's media. Instead of a logo, it's a network. Instead of a stat line, it's an audience pipeline. And when a star starts building pipelines, that's when organizations start getting tense. Because pipelines mean independence. And independence means the old rules don't hit the same. Here's another angle that matters. Fans don't just watch the games anymore. They watch the people. They follow personalities. They follow behind-the-scenes moments. They want the why behind the action. They want to feel like they know the players. That's why media roles are so valuable. It makes the athlete feel accessible and present. It turns casual interest into an actual attachment. So Caitlyn on NBC doesn't just keep the sport relevant, it keeps her relevant. And when she stays relevant, the league stays relevant by association. That should be the perfect outcome. But in sports, perfect outcomes are where the ego battles start. Because once someone becomes the gravitational center, everyone around them has to decide, do we align with it or do we resist it? And that's why the NBC move set off alarms. Not because it's wrong, not because it's scandalous, because it's powerful. And when something is powerful, people either support it or they try to contain it. Now, here's where this gets even more interesting. The NBC deal also changes how other companies view women's basketball. Sponsors don't just want athletes. They want athletes who can stay visible, who can push content, who can show up in multiple formats, who can reach different audiences. A network role signals stability. It signals mainstream viability. It signals that the athlete is more than a trending moment. And if you're an executive looking at the WNBA as an investment, that matters. Because it's one thing to bet on a league. It's another thing to bet on a league, and its biggest star being positioned as a mainstream figure year-round. That's the kind of thing that turns support into serious money. So if you're wondering why this story feels bigger than a normal headline, it's because it is. The NBC move wasn't just a career win. It was a shift in gravity. And once gravity shifts, everything that used to feel stable starts to wobble. Which brings us to the part that made this story explode, the sudden talk of warnings, conflicts, and the idea that the league might be uncomfortable with its own biggest draw becoming even bigger. And whether that part is totally true, partially true, or exaggerated, the reaction to it revealed something that's impossible to unsee. Because the real question isn't, did a letter exist? The real question is, why did so many people instantly believe the league would do something like that? And the answer to that question is where the story gets ugly. But that wasn't the whole story, because the next piece is what turned a simple NBC announcement into a full-blown controversy narrative overnight. The moment the NBC announcement settled in, something strange happened. Instead of the conversation staying focused on opportunity, on visibility, on growth, on what this meant for women's basketball, it pivoted. Fast. Suddenly, the headlines weren't about expansion. They were about tension, about conflict of interest, about whispers that the league wasn't thrilled. And here's what made it explode. It didn't need confirmation to go viral. Because in today's sports media ecosystem, perception moves faster than paperwork. The second influential voices even hinted that the WNBA might be uncomfortable with Caitlyn's move. Fans didn't wait for a press release. They reacted based on instinct. And that instinct came from years of built-up doubt. Think about it. For a long time, the WNBA narrative has lived in this weird space. On one hand, fans love the talent. They defend the athletes. They want the league to thrive. On the other hand, they constantly question leadership decisions, marketing choices, visibility strategies, growth pacing. So when rumors started swirling that Caitlyn's NBC role may have triggered internal pushback, people didn't say, that can't be right. They said, of course. That's what made this combustible. Because whether or not a formal warning letter actually hit her inbox isn't even the most important part. The most important part is how quickly the public believed it was plausible. And plausibility is everything. If fans instinctively believe a league would police its biggest star for expanding her platform, that reveals a trust problem. And trust problems are far more damaging than any single document. Then Stephen A. Smith stepped in, and that's when this went nuclear. Now, love him or hate him, Stephen A. understands narrative warfare. He knows how to turn a spark into a bonfire. He doesn't just analyze events, he dramatizes them. He frames them as power struggles, as systemic failures, as leadership miscalculations. So when he dissected the idea of the WNBA warning Caitlyn over NBC, he didn't treat it as a minor compliance issue. He treated it like sabotage. And that framing matters. Because when you tell millions of viewers that a league is actively undermining its own momentum, you're not just criticizing a decision. You're planting a seed. This organization doesn't know what it's doing. And once that seed is planted, it grows. It spreads across Twitter threads. It turns into TikTok breakdowns. It becomes YouTube thumbnails with words like exposed and meltdown. It transforms into locker room speculation and sponsor anxiety. All because the core idea hits a nerve. The idea that the league might be scared of its own star. Now let's slow this down for a second and look at why that narrative gained traction so easily. Caitlin Clark didn't enter the WNBA quietly. She didn't come in as a promising rookie who needed years to develop her brand. She entered as an earthquake. Record-breaking college ratings. Sold-out arenas. A built-in fan base that followed her like a touring concert. She was already bigger than most traditional rookie arcs allow. And when someone enters an ecosystem with that level of attention, it changes the hierarchy. It forces the league to adapt quickly. It forces other players to adjust to a different spotlight dynamic. It forces sponsors to recalibrate marketing strategies. It forces executives to rethink messaging. That kind of sudden gravity shift can either energize leadership or intimidate it. And that's why the warning storyline didn't feel random. It felt like the next chapter in a tension that's been quietly building since draft night. There's always been an undercurrent around Caitlin's rise. Some celebrate it as the lifeline women's basketball needed. Others worry it creates imbalance. Others fear it overshadows veteran players. Others question whether the league can handle being centered around one figure. So when the NBC move happened and rumors of pushback followed, it fit neatly into an already existing storyline: control versus celebrity. Even if the facts were blurry, the emotional logic felt clear to fans. And emotional logic spreads faster than verified documents ever could. Another reason this narrative caught fire? Timing. The WNBA isn't operating in a vacuum right now. There's CBA tension. There's talk about revenue sharing. There's conversation about charter flights, salaries, league expansion. There's constant pressure to prove growth is real, not just hype. In moments like that, leadership tends to be hyper-aware of optics. If they appear weak, they risk losing negotiation leverage. If they appear divided, sponsors get nervous. If they appear out of control, investors hesitate. So the idea that the league might try to assert authority over its biggest star, even symbolically, makes strategic sense in a cold, calculated way. That doesn't mean it's smart. It means it's predictable. And predictability is why the rumor stuck. Because when people see behavior that matches their expectations, they don't question it deeply. They nod and move on. But here's where it gets deeper. The phrase conflict of interest carries weight in sports. It implies rules, boundaries, governance. It sounds official. It sounds serious. It sounds like something that requires legal language. So when that phrase got attached to Caitlin's NBC role, it elevated the situation from gossip to governance. And governance is where public sympathy usually flips toward the player. Why? Because fans love stars. They trust stars more than institutions, especially when institutions are seen as bureaucratic or slow-moving. So the second this became framed as the league versus Caitlin, the league automatically lost the emotional battle. That's the danger of how this unfolded. Even if leadership simply wanted clarity, even if there were standard contractual questions, even if the entire thing was blown out of proportion by commentators looking for heat, the optics were already cooked. Because once a star looks like they're being policed for expanding their visibility, the narrative becomes about insecurity. And insecurity is not a good look for any organization. Now here's the twist that makes this even more fascinating. Sometimes rumors don't hurt because they're true. They hurt because they expose fear. If there was zero tension behind the scenes, the rumor would have died in hours. A quick denial. A quick clarification. End of story. But the fact that it lingered, that debate segments kept running, that insiders kept speculating, suggests something else. It suggests discomfort. Maybe not a formal letter. Maybe not a dramatic showdown. But discomfort with how quickly Caitlin's orbit is expanding beyond the league's traditional structure. And discomfort, when amplified by someone like Stephen A., turns into controversy lightning. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Sports leagues love control. They love controlling schedules, narratives, media access, branding guidelines, sponsorship pipelines, promotional strategies. Control equals predictability. But generational stars disrupt predictability. They attract independent deals, independent audiences, independent narratives. They blur the line between league property and personal brand. And when that happens, the power dynamic shifts. It's no longer just league markets player. It becomes player markets league. That's a subtle but massive change. Because if a player can bring eyeballs without relying entirely on league machinery, their negotiating power multiplies. And right now, with CBA conversations in the air, that leverage matters more than ever. That's why this NBC situation feels like a pressure point. It's not about a microphone. It's about who owns the spotlight. And that's why Stephen A.'s reaction wasn't calm. He framed it as a mistake, maybe even a catastrophic one, because in his view, a league should never create friction with its biggest momentum driver. Whether you agree with him or not, that framing stuck. And once it stuck, the debate wasn't about contracts anymore. It was about ego. It was about jealousy. It was about whether leadership feels threatened by a player who doesn't need to beg for relevance. Now, let's be clear. There's no official confirmation of a dramatic showdown. There's no public suspension, no fines, no explosive press conference. But sometimes the most powerful controversies are built on tension, not paperwork. The tension is real. You can feel it in how people talk about this story. You can feel it in how quickly fans choose sides. You can feel it in how every new rumor gets devoured instantly. And that tension leads to a much bigger question. Because if this really is about control, if this really is about who gets to define the future of women's basketball, then this isn't just a PR hiccup. It's a power struggle. And power struggles don't end quietly. They escalate. Which is exactly why the next layer of this story isn't about NBC. It's about authority. Because when a star becomes bigger than the system that houses them, the system has two options: adapt or push back. And what happens when a league chooses the second option? That's where this story stops being a rumor and starts becoming a reckoning. Strip away the headlines. Ignore the thumbnails. Forget the dramatic music people are layering over this story. At its core, this situation isn't about a TV segment. It's about who controls the center of gravity in women's basketball. Because every professional league runs on a quiet agreement. The league provides the platform. The players provide the talent. The platform markets the talent. The talent feeds the platform. Everyone grows together. But that balance only works when neither side becomes overwhelmingly more powerful than the other. And right now, Caitlin Clark isn't just a player inside the WNBA ecosystem. She's becoming an ecosystem of her own. That's the shift. And once that shift happens, the traditional hierarchy gets uncomfortable. Think about how leagues usually operate. The commissioner speaks for the sport. The league office handles partnerships. Media deals flow through official channels. Players are the stars, but the league is the machine. Now imagine a player who can walk into a national network studio, speak directly to millions, shape conversations, and maintain visibility without needing a league press release to amplify it. That's not just a star. That's independent influence. And independent influence changes negotiation dynamics. Because leverage doesn't just come from performance anymore. It comes from reach, from audience loyalty, from market pull. If you can move numbers by yourself, your value isn't theoretical. It's measurable. And measurable value is dangerous to institutions that rely on centralized control. Here's what makes this moment particularly volatile: timing. The WNBA isn't in a sleepy era. It's not coasting. It's in a growth phase. Media deals are bigger. Attention is higher. Expectations are louder. The CBA discussions hovering over everything at another layer of intensity, because when money is being renegotiated, power becomes extremely sensitive. In moments like this, leadership tends to want stability, predictability, unity. But generational stars don't create predictability. They create momentum. And momentum doesn't always follow a straight line. Caitlin's career has been defined by this exact pattern. She doesn't just fit into existing lanes. She widens them. She bends them. Sometimes she completely redraws them. In college, she didn't just break records. She changed viewing habits. People who hadn't watched women's basketball in years tuned in weekly. Games became primetime conversations. Debate shows talked about her like she was already a pro superstar. That kind of attention doesn't shrink when you enter a league. It grows. So the minute she entered the WNBA, the gravitational field shifted. Veteran players still matter. The league's history still matters. Leadership still matters. But the spotlight tilted. And when the spotlight tilts, perception tilts with it. That's why the NBC move feels symbolic. It signals that Caitlin isn't waiting for the league to define her visibility. She's building additional channels, additional touchpoints, additional layers of relevance. And here's the uncomfortable part. Some institutions interpret that as ambition. Others interpret it as independence. Independence is harder to control. Control isn't always about ego. Sometimes it's about fear of fragmentation. Leagues worry about fractured messaging, about stars speaking outside official talking points, about narratives spinning in directions they can't immediately manage. If a player says something controversial on a personal podcast, that's one thing. If they say it on a major network studio desk, that's magnified. So from a governance perspective, it's understandable that leadership would want clarity. But from a fan perspective, any sign of restriction feels oppressive. That's the tension line. Fans don't care about internal memos. They care about momentum. They want the sport to grow. They want stars to shine. They want authenticity. If they sense that authenticity is being boxed in, they revolt. And that's why the control narrative gained steam so quickly. Because people already suspected the league might struggle with how massive Caitlyn's presence has become. It's one thing to draft a star. It's another thing to realize that star might become the most powerful voice in your entire ecosystem. Look at other leagues. The NBA thrives because it eventually embraced player empowerment. Stars have podcasts. They have production companies. They sign broadcast deals. They shape culture beyond the hardwood. But that wasn't always comfortable. There were eras when player independence felt threatening, when leadership worried about losing grip, when the idea of athletes having independent platforms felt destabilizing. The difference is, over time, those leagues adapted. They realized that empowered stars drive growth. The question now is whether the WNBA is fully prepared for that same evolution, because Caitlyn's NBC role is a preview of what empowered WNBA players could look like in the future. Media savvy, cross-platform, visible year-round, less reliant on traditional promotional cycles. That future is exciting, but it's also disruptive. And disruption always creates friction before it creates progress. Another layer people aren't talking about enough: perception of hierarchy inside the locker room. When one player's visibility explodes beyond everyone else's, it can create complicated dynamics. Not necessarily jealousy, but imbalance. Veterans who have carried the league for years might feel overshadowed. Young players might feel pressure to brand build faster than they're ready for. The league office might feel the need to maintain equilibrium. So when Caitlyn steps into a major network role, it doesn't just affect her. It reorders the ecosystem. That's why this moment feels heavier than a simple announcement. It's a preview of a new power structure. And power structures are rarely reshaped quietly. Here's where it gets even sharper. Control in sports isn't just about rules. It's about narrative ownership. Who tells the story? Who frames the controversy? Who decides what's emphasized and what's ignored? For decades, leagues controlled narrative flow through partnerships and media channels. But now, athletes have direct lines to fans. Social media, podcasts, streaming, now major network contributor roles. Each new platform reduces institutional exclusivity. So if Caitlyn becomes a recurring voice on a national stage, she isn't just participating in coverage. She's shaping it. And that's where leadership tension often spikes. Because shaping the narrative means influencing perception. Influencing perception means influencing leverage. And leverage is everything in negotiation seasons. Which brings us back to the CBA backdrop hovering over all of this. When players and league leadership are navigating revenue splits, growth strategies, and future investments, the side with more public sympathy often gains soft power. If the public overwhelmingly sees Caitlyn as the driver of growth and sees leadership as resistant, that sympathy shifts toward players. That's not a minor detail. That's strategic oxygen. So whether or not there was a literal warning letter becomes almost secondary. The core issue is perception of control. Does the league look confident and forward-thinking? Or does it look reactive and territorial? That perception affects sponsors. It affects media partners. It affects players considering long-term commitments. It even affects potential expansion investors watching from the sidelines. Because nobody wants to align with an organization that appears unstable during its most important growth window. And instability isn't always chaos. Sometimes it's subtle tension that leaks into public discourse. Right now, that's what we're seeing. Subtle tension amplified into a national conversation. And Stephen A. didn't just comment on it, he weaponized it rhetorically. He framed it as institutional insecurity. Whether that's fully fair or not is up for debate. But the impact is undeniable. Because once a league is painted as afraid of its own star, the burden shifts to leadership to prove otherwise. And proving otherwise requires decisive clarity. Silence fuels speculation. Ambiguity fuels distrust. And distrust spreads faster than highlights ever could. Here's the part that makes this especially delicate. Caitlin doesn't have to say anything inflammatory for this to escalate. She doesn't need to attack the league. She doesn't need to issue ultimatums. Her mere existence as a powerful independent brand is enough to test the system. That's what generational influence does. It exposes whether institutions are ready to evolve. If they embrace it, the sport ascends. If they resist it, fractures form. And fractures in sports ecosystems don't just affect one season. They shape eras. Which leads to the next layer of this story, the financial pressure. Because once control gets questioned, money starts paying attention. And money is far less patient than fans. Sponsors don't tolerate instability. Networks don't tolerate confusion. Investors don't tolerate leadership that appears reactive. So if this power tension continues to simmer, the real consequences won't show up in tweets. They'll show up in boardrooms. And that's where things can escalate far beyond a television role. Because when the financial engine starts recalculating risk, everything changes. And that's exactly why the next part of this story isn't about emotions. It's about dollars. And dollars don't care about pride. They care about returns. Here's the thing most fans don't think about when they argue on social media. Leagues don't survive on vibes. They survive on money. Broadcast contracts, sponsorship agreements, licensing deals, advertising commitments, expansion investments. Those are the real pillars. The games are the product, yes, but the money is the oxygen. And when there's even a hint of instability around the league's biggest asset, the oxygen level gets checked immediately. That's why this NBC situation, rumor, tension, narrative, whatever you want to call it, became bigger than a sports debate. Because NBC isn't just a random outlet. It's a partner, a broadcaster, a multi-billion-dollar media engine that just committed to putting women's basketball on a national stage. That kind of relationship is strategic. So imagine you're sitting in a network executive meeting. You've invested heavily in coverage. You're building studio shows. You're mapping out promotional plans. You're planning future crossovers. You're projecting ratings tied to one of the most talked-about athletes in the sport. And then suddenly, online chatter suggests the league might not love how visible that athlete is becoming outside direct league supervision. Even if it's exaggerated, even if it's misinterpreted, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is expensive. Because sponsors and networks operate on predictability. They want clarity. They want to know the league and its stars are aligned. They want forward momentum, not internal friction narratives dominating headlines. This is where Stephen E.'s reaction amplified risk perception. When he framed the situation as leadership undermining its own golden opportunity, he wasn't just criticizing governance. He was indirectly asking a much louder question. If the league can't manage momentum properly, can it manage growth at scale? That question echoes in boardrooms. Now let's zoom out. The WNBA is in one of the most pivotal eras in its history. Attention is up. Ratings are rising. Social engagement is climbing. The CBA discussions hovering over everything are shaping what the next decade will look like. Expansion conversations are happening. Investors are watching closely. This isn't a time for mixed messaging. It's a time for confidence. So when the narrative turns into league versus star, even if that framing is partially dramatized, it disrupts the image of unity. And unity matters to money. Sponsors don't just buy logos on jerseys. They buy association. They align their brand values with the league's direction. They want to be attached to empowerment, progress, stability. If the conversation shifts toward power struggles and insecurity, that branding alignment weakens. Now, to be clear, there's no confirmed sponsor mass exit, no public partner meltdown, no official network condemnation. But what happens behind closed doors is rarely loud at first. It's quiet recalculation. It's legal teams reviewing clauses. It's marketing departments asking, is this sustainable? It's financial models adjusting risk. That's how real consequences begin, not with dramatic headlines, but with subtle hesitation. And hesitation in a growth phase is dangerous. Because this is the moment women's basketball is trying to solidify its long-term commercial footing. The NBC role wasn't just symbolic visibility. It was validation. It signaled that mainstream media sees the sport as premium content worth investing in year-round. That's a milestone. But milestones come with pressure. Because once big money is in the room, expectations rise. And if big money senses misalignment between league leadership and its most marketable player, it starts asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, who controls messaging? Who controls access? Who controls long-term direction? And most importantly, are the people in charge fully aligned with the growth strategy? Here's the cold reality. Caitlin Clark isn't just valuable because she scores points. She's valuable because she attracts eyeballs. Eyeballs equal ad revenue. Ad revenue equals contract leverage. Contract leverage equals growth. If she appears on NBC and pulls viewers into broader women's basketball coverage, that's a multiplier effect. But if headlines about internal friction overshadow that coverage, the multiplier weakens. That's why this moment feels fragile. Not explosive, but fragile. It's like a test of maturity. Is the league ready to fully operate in a star-driven media ecosystem? Or is it still adjusting to how quickly influence can outpace infrastructure? And here's the subtle danger for leadership. If the perception takes hold that Caitlin is the engine behind financial growth, then her leverage in negotiations, formal or informal, increases dramatically, especially with CBA talks in the background. Because if players collectively recognize that star-driven visibility strengthens their position, it changes tone inside the locker room too. And that leads to ripple effects. Players talk. Agents talk. Sponsors talk. Media executives talk. When there's a narrative of leadership tension, it circulates quietly. Not always as open revolt, but as cautious observation. Let's see how this plays out. Those 5 words are dangerous in a growth window, because momentum requires confidence, and confidence requires clarity. Now imagine the opposite scenario. Imagine the league immediately frames Caitlin's NBC role as a win for everyone. Public alignment, public celebration, clear messaging. That stabilizes the narrative. But when ambiguity lingers, speculation fills the gap. And speculation, when amplified by high-profile commentators, becomes reality in the public mind. That's what happened here. Stephen A. didn't just react emotionally. He reframed the situation as strategic incompetence. And once incompetence becomes the storyline, financial stakeholders get cautious. They may not pull out. They may not panic. But they become watchful. And watchfulness slows bold moves, which is the last thing a growing league wants. There's another angle that makes this even more delicate. Competition. Not necessarily another league launching tomorrow, but the idea of alternative platforms emerging. If investors see opportunity in star-driven ecosystems, they don't always wait for permission. They explore. Private equity in women's sports is rising. Media companies are hungry for exclusive content. Athlete-led projects are expanding across sports. If a generational star ever felt boxed in, conversations could shift. That possibility alone increases her leverage. And leverage, when visible, forces institutions to choose between collaboration and control. The smart move is collaboration. But collaboration requires humility. And humility in leadership isn't always easy, especially when public narratives question authority. So now we're in a moment where money is watching. Sponsors are observing tone. Networks are measuring optics. Players are gauging leverage. Fans are choosing sides. And leadership has to decide how to respond without looking defensive. Because defensive posture fuels the control narrative. And the control narrative fuels further speculation. It's a loop. One that can either stabilize or spiral depending on the next move. And here's what makes this even more layered. Caitlin hasn't said much. She hasn't escalated publicly. She hasn't fanned flames. Which means all the pressure right now sits on perception of leadership. Silence from her side keeps the spotlight on institutional response. And when institutions carry the spotlight alone during controversy, every micromove gets analyzed. Every delayed statement. Every vague quote. Every non-answer. That's why this phase of the story is crucial. Because once money starts watching closely, the margin for missteps shrinks. And this isn't just about the present. It's about the next decade. Women's basketball is at a pivot point. It can either cement this era as the beginning of sustained mainstream growth, or it can allow internal tension narratives to chip away at credibility. And credibility is currency. Lose it once, and you spend years earning it back. That's why this NBC situation, again, regardless of the exact details behind the scenes, matters so much. It's a stress test, not of Caitlyn's talent, not of fan loyalty, but of leadership adaptability. Because in modern sports, star power is not something you suppress. It's something you strategically amplify. And if amplification turns into anxiety, the entire ecosystem feels it. Which leads to the next pressure point. Because money watching is one thing. But when the locker room starts watching too, that's when tension shifts from narrative to internal reality. And that's where this story could get even more complicated. Here's where this stops being a media debate and starts becoming something much bigger. Money watching is one thing, but the locker room watching? That's different. Because players feel tension before the public does. They notice tone. They notice posture. They notice how leadership responds when power shifts, even slightly. And whether or not there was ever a dramatic warning, the narrative alone raised a quiet question inside the league. If this is how they react when the biggest star expands her platform, what does that mean for everyone else? That question doesn't need to be loud to matter. The WNBA is already in a sensitive phase. CBA conversations, revenue growth, expansion talks, rising expectations. In moments like that, alignment is everything. Players want to feel like leadership understands where the league is heading. They want confidence, not territorial energy. Because here's the reality. Caitlyn's visibility isn't shrinking. It's expanding. And when one player becomes a year-round media presence, it changes the blueprint for everyone. It shows that influence doesn't have to live only inside the league calendar. It shows that players can build leverage beyond stat sheets. That's empowering. But empowerment shifts dynamics. If the perception forms that leadership is uncomfortable with independent influence, players notice. Not necessarily as rebellion, but as awareness. Awareness of leverage. Awareness of branding power. Awareness that this era is different from the last. And that's where Caitlyn's silence becomes the most strategic move of all. She hasn't escalated. She hasn't attacked. She hasn't fueled the drama. She stayed calm. And calm confidence in a power moment is destabilizing, in a good way for her. Because silence shifts pressure upward. If she had publicly criticized the league, it would have forced a confrontation. Instead, her quiet posture keeps the spotlight on leadership's response. And that's powerful. If the league overreacts, it looks defensive. If the league backs off quietly, it looks like her leverage won. Either way, her influence is reinforced without her having to say a word. That's modern power. And this is where the era-defining fork appears. The WNBA has two paths. Path 1, embrace the acceleration. Publicly align. Frame her NBC role as a strategic win. Show sponsors, players, and fans that star-driven growth is welcome. That builds trust. That builds confidence. That compounds momentum. Path 2, subtly manage it. Reinforce control. Maintain rigid narrative ownership. That builds tension. And tension in a growth phase is dangerous. Because women's basketball isn't in survival mode anymore, it's in expansion mode. Attention is rising. Media partners are serious. Cultural relevance is climbing. This is the window where long-term habits are formed. Generational stars don't slow down for institutional comfort. Institutions either evolve with them or risk looking outdated. And the audience is watching closely. Fans today understand leverage. They understand branding. They understand power shifts. If they sense insecurity at the top, they call it out. If they sense confidence and collaboration, they amplify it. So this moment isn't about a television segment. It's about identity. What kind of league does the WNBA want to be in this new era? One that celebrates independent star power as fuel for growth? Or one that treats it cautiously? Caitlyn Clark will keep playing. She'll keep drawing attention. She'll keep expanding her platform. That trajectory isn't changing. The real variable is how the league chooses to move alongside it. Because when generational influence meets institutional structure, history gets written. And right now, quietly, strategically, that history is being shaped. The next move won't be loud, but it will matter. A lot. If this situation tells us anything, it's this. Modern sports aren't controlled by institutions alone anymore. They're shaped by influence, by visibility, by leverage. And Caitlyn Clark represents a new level of all three. The WNBA has a historic opportunity in front of it. The attention is real. The partnerships are real. The growth is real. The only question left is whether leadership fully embraces the speed of this new era. Because when generational talent meets institutional power, history gets written. And we're watching that history unfold in real time. If you want to stay ahead of every development, every shift, every behind-the-scenes ripple in women's basketball, make sure you subscribe right now. Because this story isn't finished. The next move, whether quiet or bold, could reshape everything. And when it happens, you'll want to hear it here first.